Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nadita Ramachala, and I'd like to welcome all the participants to our stakeholder consultation on our governance standards. Please note that the ground rules were already established in the presentation that is showing. Today's session will be recorded, so you will see a message stating that the meeting has been recorded and it is also being streamed live on YouTube. Without further ado, I would like to welcome all the participants to today's session and introduce Mr. Rodney Ramnath, Acting Executive Director of the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards, to deliver welcome remarks. Rodney, I turn the session over to you.
Thank you, Nadisa. Just doing a quick mic check to see if you're hearing me.
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, great. Thanks. Good morning, everyone. It is my privilege to welcome you to the stakeholder consultation on the draft national standards related to governance. Trinidad and Tobago has been very active in the work of ISO Technical Committee TC309 for governance of organizations. We hold participating status in this committee established by the International Organization for Standardization, also known as ISO. The Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards, or TTBS, in its capacity as a national standards body and a full member of ISO, twinned with BSI to co-lead the development of ISO 37000, which is the first international standard for governance of organizations. The foundation for long-term success of organizations is built upon principles of good governance, as this ensures that organizations contribute to the protection and restoration of social, economic, and natural environmental systems. It is through the building and maintenance of trust, good governance contributes to improved business performance as well as to sustainable social and environmental welfare. Developed by experts and trusted voices from a wide range of organizations in over 70 countries around the world, ISO 37000 provides a single, globally accepted reference for all kinds of organizations, regardless of size, type, or location. Dr. Axel Kravatsky, Vice Chair of ISO TC309 and Working Group 1, co-convener, leads the team of national experts on the TTBS's National Mirror Committee, who have provided their expertise in the development of ISO 37000 and other international standards, namely ISO 37001, 2016, Anti-Bribery Management Systems, Requirements with Guidance for Use, TTS/ISO 37002, 2021, Whistleblowing Management Systems Guidelines, and ISO 37301, 2021, Compliance Management Systems, Requirements with Guidance for Use. I would also like to recognize Ms. Deborah Souza Akpofabri from the University of West Indies, whose vice chairs the NMC, for her contribution at the national level and within the ISO TC309. Also, the NMC for governance comprises stakeholders from a number of organizations and provides multifaceted perspectives to assist in providing feedback and establishing national positions on the international standards related to governance. The committee members come from public sector, private sector, including chambers of commerce and trade associations, financial sector, not-for-profit organizations, academia, SMEs, and family-owned businesses. The national involvement in the work of the development of international standards started in 2017, and it has been a significant journey for TTBS and the National Mirror Committee for Governance of Organizations. Under the leadership of Dr. Kravatsky, who played a pioneering role in Working Group 1 of ISO TC309, TC meaning Technical Committee, as part of a co-convener based on a twinning arrangement with the British Standards Institution, Trinidad and Tobago has been able to play a significant role in the drafting of the International Standard for Governance of Organizations. Several webinars were also held in 2019 to raise awareness of these 4 international standards and provide input into the international standards development process. ISO 37000 was officially published in September 2021, and TTBS is now in the process of adopting the standard and the other governance-related standards as Trinidad and Tobago standards. The adoption of these standards is directly aligned to TTBS's mandate under the Standards Act, number 18 of 97, and its mission statement. And to quote, that is to champion the development and implementation of standards, measurement systems, and conformity assessment services for the competitiveness and sustainability of Trinidad and Tobago, end quote. Indeed, the publication of ISO 37000 was a tremendous milestone, and we are pleased to have facilitated and contributed to the international efforts aimed at reaching consensus on an international standard to contribute to building robust governance systems to mitigate risks, as well as improving transparency and accountability in all types and sizes of organizations and all levels of society. Today's webinar will highlight the key requirements of the draft standards and will allow stakeholders to provide feedback before they are finalized and issued as national standards. We have invited a broad range of stakeholders from the public and private sectors, NGOs, consultants, practitioners, and members of the public to share your concerns, recommendations, and feedback on the standards. I would like to thank the members of the National Mirror Committee for their outstanding work in the development of the international standards. At today's session, we hear from Dr. Kravatsky, Ms. Andrea Primus, a key member of the NMC and ISO TC 309, as well as Ms. Nadita Ramachala, the manager of the Standardization Division. In conclusion, I wish you all a very productive session. Please feel free to contribute your comments and recommendations towards the finalization of these important governance-related standards. As a stakeholder, your involvement is integral to the integrity of the standardization process, and I encourage you to actively participate in this and other standards development projects as we work together to build our national quality infrastructure. Thank you for your attention and participation.
Thank you, Rodney, for delivering the welcome and also giving us a historical perspective into the development of these international standards that we are now adopting as Trinidad and Tobago as our national standards. So I will be delivering a presentation on the international standards development process. So please allow me one moment while I share my screen. Okay, so most of you all would be familiar with our standards development process in some form or fashion, but I will go very quickly into some of the key highlights of the international standards development process. To recap TTBS and its mandate, we operate under the Standards Act number 18 of 1997, and one of our key roles is that of the national standards body. However, we also have other roles such as the National Quality Certifying Body, the National Laboratory Accreditation Body, and the National Measurement Institute, as we are given that mandate under the Metrology Act number 18 of 2004. Two critical policies and strategies would be our National Quality Policy and our National Standardization Strategy, both of which are available on the TTBS's website. To highlight the vision and mission of TTBS, we are the essential provider of national quality solutions leading to a standards-conscious society that is globally competitive. I would skip now to our standards-related mandate. Under the Standards Act number 18 of 1997, we are responsible for the development and maintenance of standards for the improvement of goods produced or used in Trinidad and Tobago to ensure industrial efficiency and development, to promote public and industrial welfare, health and safety, and for the protection of the environment. We are also responsible for coordinating participation in regional and international standardization. We should be familiar with the ISO work, or Rodney would have highlighted some of the key objectives with regard to the governance standards. So we participate in the International Organization for Standardization. And also there's a sister international body, the IEC, the International Electrotechnical Commission, responsible for essentially electrical standards. We also participate in CROSSQ, the CARICOM Regional Organization for Standards and Quality. And there is one other regional body that we also participate in, which is COPANT, or the Pan American Standards Commission. So TTBS would be essentially the conduit for the national feedback into the regional and international standardization systems. And to recap quickly, what is a standard? A standard is a technical document that provides an agreed upon repeatable way of doing something. They provide commonly accepted and repeatable way of defining objective technical requirements of products. And for products, we mean both goods and services. Standards are used to foster trade, protect health and safety, protect the environment, support sustainability objectives, and also promote innovation. Whether we know it or not, standards are part of our daily life. Anything grown, produced, and traded is subject to standards. And today we are here to discuss standards related to governance. At the TTBS, we have the responsibility of developing two types of standards, voluntary. And voluntary means that standards can be used at the discretion of business to improve performance, meet environmental objectives, support innovation, improve quality practices within organizations, and they are market-driven. For standards that are compulsory, TTBS has a responsibility of enforcing these standards. They essentially have the status of law, and it mainly focuses on health, safety, or environmental issues. I wanted to recap on our national standardization strategy. This document is available on our TTBS website, and it essentially contains our 3-year work program. We would have utilized a lot of data to help in the development of the national standardization strategy. We collected information from stakeholders directly, and we also looked at areas where we can improve export competitiveness, improve health and safety, address any societal issues, and support government policies in areas such as the environment, climate change, energy efficiency, renewable energy, and also supporting policies related to improving disaster mitigation, resilience. So a lot of work was done in the development of the national standardization strategy. We collected information directly from stakeholders, and we would have looked at a prioritization process to ensure that we were developing standards that would have a material impact on our national society. Some of the key emerging areas included sustainability, governance, the circular economy, innovation, e-commerce, sustainable building materials. And I would like to touch on the role of international standards and also look at the ISO processes for developing standards. An international standard is a document that has been developed through the consensus of experts from many countries. Rodney would have indicated that over 70 countries participated in the development of ISO 27000, and they also participate as experts on the overall Technical Committee 309. ISO would have published these documents, and they are the internationally recognized standardization body for the world, together with the IEC, as well as another organization called the International Telecommunications Union. So international standards would comprise rules, guidelines, processes, characteristics that allow users to achieve the same outcome time and time again. One of the well-known bodies that have the status of international standardization would be the ASTM International, well recognized in the construction sector. A lot of building materials that we utilize within the country conform to ASTM standards, and they have also been utilized by the TTBS as a basis of many of our national standards covering construction goods. The ISO governance structure is one that TTBS would participate in at several levels. There's a General Assembly, a council, and at the level that we are discussing today, there are technical committees, such as the Technical Committee for Governance. We have experts that also participate in these committees. And to support the international standardization system, there are several policy development committees. CASCO, responsible for conformity assessment, CAPOLCO, responsible for consumer issues, and DEVCO, to represent the interests of developing countries. As we indicated previously, there are several levels of participation. Some of you all may be familiar with being an ISO expert. TTBS would be the ISO member, and there's also the Central Secretariat at ISO's headquarters in Geneva. Just a quick run through of the international standards development process. Experts essentially develop the technical content of the standards. There's a neutral platform for experts to get together and achieve consensus. And consensus meaning that there's no sustained opposition to the technical requirements. There is the Central Secretariat, as I indicated before. However, the experts really drive the international standardization system, because it is due to the technical expertise that we can craft the requirements that are generally accepted across the world. In terms of the different stages, there has to be a proposal. The draft standard would be prepared. There would essentially be a committee. Then the standard is issued for inquiry, and then there are subsequent approval processes followed by publication. ISO would normally keep the standards under systematic review, and if there's a reason where the standard is no longer appropriate or it has become obsolete, the standard will be withdrawn. So TTBS's standards development process closely mirrors the international process. So depending on your level of engagement with TTBS previously, you may have been one of our experts, or you may have provided comments during the public comment period, which is where we are today with our 4 governance standards. Again, another depiction of the process. I should note that once the international standards are published by ISO, then TTBS will take a strategic decision to adopt as national standards. Again, the ISO technical committees can comprise subcommittees. Subcommittees would normally comprise a number of experts, and essentially these committees would manage the entire standards development process using a project management approach. Experts are normally responsible for contributing their voluntary technical expertise. They represent themselves and they provide TTBS with updates based on the different meetings attended. And experts are encouraged to attend ISO meetings, conferences, and workshops periodically, and also to follow the work of the International Technical Committee. And this is where, as a country, we can make a significant contribution to the development of international standards. Again, the National Mirror Committee, Rodney would have highlighted our NMC for governance. They essentially mirror the work of the ISO Technical Committee, and they are responsible for making a recommendation to TTBS on national position and draft international standards and other deliverables produced by ISO. Again, we have a number of volunteers that comprise our National Mirror Committee. They provide inputs into the development of standards at the international level with a view to shaping the final document to ensure that these documents are suitable for our country. So this is the end of my presentation. on the development of international standards. I will now stop the sharing, and I am pleased to introduce you to Dr. Axel Kravatsky. Axel is the managing partner of Syntegra ESG, and he has been playing a leading role in the development of the ISO standards for governance. He's the vice chair of ISO TC 309. He also serves as co-convener of Working Group 1, as well as the technical editor for Working Group 1, which is the foundational group that is looking at governance standards, and they would have directly worked on ISO 37000. I would now invite Axel to share his screen and deliver his presentation. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the webinar, and thank you, Nadita. I would like to propose that I just have a quick feedback poll to say, maybe you can just quickly type in the chat. Do you currently use standards or codes for governance, for whistleblowing, for compliance, or for anti-bribery? Just a quick yes, no answer. Right, so we have quite a few number of persons who are using standards and guidance, but also some who are not yet. That is fine. Perfect. Okay, thank you. Can I ask you also to quickly type in the chat what aspects of the topics that we have proposed to cover, which are the 4 standards that are going to be adopted. What aspects are you most interested in? Is there any specific aspects that you are most interested in? Or is it a general overview and finding out? Are there any specific aspects that you're interested in? Okay, governance and compliance. Compliance management, okay, great. We will performance appraisals. Well, we're not going to go deeply into performance appraisals. We look at a little bit at performance, what it means, but it's not directly appraisals. Well, we're not exactly, but if we're not really on FATF, but if you apply these guidance, then you are standing well beyond what FATF requires. In the public sector, it's applied generally, yes. Compliance, yes. Okay, good. So all these topics will be there. And one of the things to think about is, so a lot of interest in the compliance part, which is great. And we are looking at how compliance fits within the overall governance framework, and including in the private sector. Okay, great. So thank you so much for your feedback. And so after every standard, we're going to have a brief question and answer clarification. And then in the end, we're going to have, so first clarifications that are directly related to the standard. And then at the end, we're going to come to a general question and answer discussion about any topics that you would like further information on. Okay, so the first thing to be also clear on is, why would we have these international standards now? And the simplest answer and the most straightforward, as well as the truth, is that there is a lot of change happening in the world, and including in Trinidad and Tobago. So there are new types of organizations. The organizations have new needs. There are different expectations that people have of them. Society has changed, and the expectations by society in relation to organizations, employees' expectations have changed, and technology is also transforming the organization. So overall, there's a lot that needs to be governed, and the governance systems need to be fit for purpose. Now, you may say that, but aren't there all these other codes that already exist in Trinidad and in 2013. There's the Trinidad and Tobago Corporate Governance Code. What about that, or all the other, or the central bank guidelines, which were updated a couple of years ago? So what about all these aspects? And the general answer is to say those are still valid in their, it is specific bodies that are issuing those according to their own remit. And their consultations and what they do is consistent with that remit. But when you look at that, you see that there are there's a large variation as to who develops these codes, and therefore then also to whom they apply. And one of the useful things to think about is how the hierarchy of how laws and regulations and standards and guidance fits together. So here's a graphical overview of that. So we have the international order, and that takes greatest precedent. Then you have the national legal order. Then you have external mandatory regulations. So for example, if you're listed on the stock exchange, or if you are a financial or a regulated company, then what the central bank says, for example, or the stock exchange says is mandatory. And then there are also external voluntary regulations. Now, ISO standards fall within that category. And it is the organization that chooses to apply these, and in order for it to derive some benefits. Part of the benefits is to be able to apply the external mandatory and the national legal order in a much better way, okay? In addition to that, it is also about the ISO standards, or the external voluntary regulations lead to internal voluntary regulations. So that is policies that organizations adopt because they think they are well suited for that which they're trying to achieve, okay? So there's a hierarchy in this. Now, one of the important and unique things about the ISO standards is that they apply to all countries, all sectors, all types of organizations, okay? So within Trinidad and Tobago, we are frequently asked, for example, by statutory authorities, what standards should they be using? And so often they go to the Performance Monitoring Manual or the Trinidad and Tobago Corporate Governance Code and so forth. And they are not wrong in being informed by these, but they are not fully applicable to them. And so in the case of the ISO standards, they are fully applicable, okay? So that is and why? Because all these types of organizations and all the sectors and all the countries have been participating in the development of the standard itself. So in addition to what Nadita has shared about the overall process, let me introduce a little bit about more details about Technical Committee 309, Governance of Organizations, okay? So in the Strategic Business Plan, which this Technical Committee adopted in 2018, the primary purpose of good governance is to promote sound decision-making by leaders on behalf and for the benefit of the stakeholders to whom they owe legal and moral accountability. Now, this has been evolved, and this is still part of the Strategic Business Plan of the Technical Committee. I'm currently leading the review of the Strategic Business Plan. At this point, it is still the consensus of the Technical Committee. Now let's look at specifically at the organization itself, how the Technical Committee is organized. You can see that it is a fairly well-developed committee, and so it has a few groupings that are working on behalf of the committee as a whole. And then you have working groups, one for each standard, as it were. In working group 1, we have published 37,000 and are currently working on 37,005 and 6, which are about indicators of good governance. Overall, there are about 77 members in the Technical Committee, and you can see about 217 members in the working group 1. The technical committee also has 25 liaison organizations, and these are listed here. So these are organizations that participate and have access to all the records and all the meetings, and who give their feedback both in person as well as in writing. And then you have here is a little overview of the overall system of standards of what falls within TC 309. You can see that all the parts that belong are within scope here, right? So there are governance dimensions as well as management dimensions. And today we're going to talk about all the ones that have been published and that Trinidad and Tobago is adopting as national standards. So here we have the foundational standard, which is 37,000, governance of organizations, and compliance management was previously published as 19,600. And it was a guidance standard. It is now a management system standards with requirements. So it is also auditable. And I will go a little bit more into that process. And then we have anti-bribery, whistleblowing, and other standards being developed, okay? And there are, of course, within the ISO system, there are other standards that relate to governance. So for example, governance of IT 38500 is currently being revised and is currently proposing, for example, to use 37,000 to be normative. That is to say, it is the foundation from which they start. So everything they just built on top of that and elaborated from the governance of IT perspective. There's also data and human governance. There are many more dimensions. And in the management systems, there are very many standards that are also relevant. For example, risk, social responsibility. These are large and very popular, important standards that fit into the entire system. How do these standards that we are discussing today fit? So for example, standards come in a number of different types. There are management system standards and other kind of standards. Within management systems, there are type A and type B. Type A are requirement standards, and type B are guidance standards. So anti-bribery and compliance are management system standards with requirements, and therefore they can be certified because you can certify something that is required. The guidance, for example, on whistleblowing is using the same structure as as other management system standards, so those, for example, type A, but instead of shall, it's using the word should. So therefore, it is a guidance standard, and since it's only a should and not a shall, you can't certify that an organization is applying all parts because the organization can choose which parts are most relevant and how it interprets that. In the case of other standards, 37,000 is a guidance standard. So therefore it's using should and not shall. And the other standards that are also currently being developed also fall in that. There is also technical specification being developed, and there's a handbook that has been published on 37,001, which is the anti-bribery. So what are the overall benefits? And let's lead with 37,000. And by adopting such a standard, there are four main groups of benefits we can think of. One, it is enabling. So an organization that is adopting the standard will be able to apply external mandatory or internal voluntary policies and regulations and legislation with much greater ease. And for those that do not currently have standards, for example, there are many state bodies and sporting bodies and many type of organizations for which there are currently no wide consensus agreements on what good governance constitutes. They now have that. It also allows comparison across organizations. So organization, for example, that would like to work with a nonprofit and says that I shall only spend money and resources onto organizations that are well governed, that have good compliance systems. Now you have the standard on which you can compare whether you're using the same language and are able to compare the suitability and the effectiveness of these standards. It's also complementary in that there are 23,000+ standards, ISO standards, many technical, many engineering, and we'll have a look at some of these numbers. And now these standards are complementary to that. So if you're using it, for example, for quality management or risk management, then you will have reference to, for example, the governing body. But the work of the governing body was not in itself defined before. So now you have a standard that defines all the aspects that pertain to the governance of the organization and what, for example, governing bodies need to do within that context. And so it is complementary to the rest. It is also inclusive in the sense that every country that is participating in the process needs to establish a national mirror committee and engage the national stakeholders across a number of different groups, from academia to state to civil society to business to consumers. All of these aspects need to be covered and are being covered around the world. And so therefore, it is a very inclusive process and transparent process for being able to do that. So this much about the general background. Now let's dive into the 37,000. And even in 37,000, I will start with a bit of an introduction relating to the overall evolution in the governance landscape, so that you can see how it fits in, both locally, but particularly internationally. There has been a lot of change, and a lot of the topics that are currently, so this field has evolved quite a lot. So let's look at those aspects. And so governance is, for example, absolutely critical to for sustainable development. Okay, we cannot realize unless we have good governance at all levels, and that needs to be transparent, effective, and organizations need to be accountable. And we are currently in the decade of action, so it's the last 8 years for us to be able to achieve these sustainable development goals. And with the pandemic, most of the world has fallen even further behind on achieving these objectives. And so therefore, it is of utmost critical importance that organizations are governed well, so that collectively we can achieve the sustainable development goals. And overall, we can see a big trend in that organizations are committed, and groups of organizations, for example, the Roundtable and the World Economic Forum, and in many different other fora, you find that organizations and these collective associations are publicly committing to the fact that they need to be accountable and produce value for all stakeholders. So that includes shareholders, but others as well. And that it cannot be focused only on one group at the expense of others, because collectively we are in the same boat, and the world has moved in its view of how the world operates and how things are connected. The second big aspect that has happened is that, of course, that climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and many other environmental, as well as social dimensions, crime, trust in organizations, and civil society, and so forth. A lot of these different dimensions are under threat, are fragile, and so a lot of organizations, including financial markets, have committed themselves since 2006 to really support the UN Development Goals, or sustainability agenda. It was called different before 2015, but the term ESG was created by the United Nations Environment Program, the financial division or part, PI, and it is about aligning financial systems with the goals. What goals? What it is the achievement of purpose. So most international bodies now and most trends, including large institutional investors, are now insisting that every organization should define its purpose, and so that it is embedding its purpose at the center of the organization, and it is not just doing blindly and for some stakeholders, as opposed to really fulfilling its true purpose and to solve problems for people or planet in a profitable way in the case of, or a viable way for all organizations. So these are some of the very big trends that have happened in this period. And we can also look at, for example, changes in disclosure requirements. So remember that the purpose of an ISO standard is to enable organizations to apply external mandatory, for example, regulation, legislation, and so forth. So there is a lot that has happened in there, in that space. For example, in the case of the European Union, we now have non-financial reporting directives. We also have the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group that is working, for example, together with the Global Reporting Initiative, and that are making sustainability standards and sustainability reporting coming to the core. The IFRS has created a new standards board, the ISSB, the International Standard Sustainability Board, Sustainability Standards Board, and that is anticipated to produce the first draft standards by the end of this year. And so it is important for organizations to be able to apply and work towards these international expectations, which are then also adopted at the national level. So that is why it is important to have these kind of standards so that they are enabled and that together we can achieve the sustainability goals. So for example, it is already true that by the Financial Stability Board that created the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which are now made mandatory by a number of stock exchanges around the world. So a lot of large organizations now need to report on these topics. Now, all of this is a lot that has happened, and that it is helpful to have sort of even a little bit of a global view, because the ISO standard is currently the strongest and the first internationally agreed standard through which you will and are able to conform with these requirements, even as they emerge, because these organizations, for example, the Integrated Reporting, the IIRC, the International Integrated Reporting Council, which has now consolidated together with the SASB, the Standard Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and the CDSB have all come together in, well, first these two consolidated into the Value Reporting Foundation, and then together they are part of the ISSB that I mentioned before. So a lot of consolidation, a lot of changes. So any organization that would like to govern well and report and perform at this international expectation level will be enabled through the ISO standards to do just that. And it is important not to get lost and confused by all these different dimensions. And it is helpful to think about three things. For example, think about the governance foundations. Every organization exists for a meaningful reason, okay? And meaningful means that it is connected with some form of value and values. So organizations are meaningful, have meaningful reasons to exist once they are creating something of value to stakeholders, okay? And it's the role of governance to provide the direction, the oversight, and accountability for and of the organization so that they are clear about what the goals are, the parameters within which to achieve that. And until recently, so before this existence of this standard, for example, in this most comprehensive format, some organizations really believe that they are there to optimize financial benefits for their shareholders. So for many, this self-interest was actually institutionalized, and that is now corrected, and it is international consensus about what the way to think about that is. And by externalizing a lot of the negative values that the organization has produced, and not focusing on the long-term well-being of society and the means, so the nature upon which and with which it is creating this well-being for people, has led to a lot of unsustainability. So the system has generated financial returns at the expense of social and environmental dimensions, and led the world to the point where the Secretary General of the United Nations calls for Code Red because of the Caribbean in its representation to the Glasgow Conference of the Parties to the climate agreement, called for 1.5 degrees to stay alive, because anything more is reducing the possibility for continuing to survive to its very fundamentals. Okay, so therefore, in this way, a new governance norm has emerged and is building upon the best and the most consistent thinking around the world. So the organizations, in order to play their part, need an instrument for them to play their role. So if they are to contribute to solving the problems of people and planet, to create value, ultimate value to people and nature, they need guidance. And this guidance is ISO 37000, combined with the other standards, for example, compliance, whistleblowing, anti-bribery, all of which together form the governance framework, or components of the governance framework. And so it was developed, there was a scoping period for 1 year between 2016 and 2017. Then there was a 4-year development, 77 countries, 24 liaison organizations. More than 1,500 unique comments were resolved in writing for everybody, and consensus always increased. And in the final ballot, all 164 ISO members were invited to vote, and it passed with 100% approval, which is a remarkable achievement. And so it was published internationally on the 14th of September. And this instrument is therefore the first global standard on the governance of organizations. It's the benchmark for how to put purpose at the center of governance and to how to direct organizations ethically, responsibly, and effectively. It is fundamental in the sense that it is foundational and fundamental for the organizational purpose, the values, the ethics, the accountability, and the internal control and assurance systems, as well as risk governance. So in addition to risk management, also it is ISO 37000 is fundamental to risk governance. A great benefit is that it reduces the complexity and the costs. You can see that there are a lot of developments, a lot of changes, and so governing bodies and all involved in governance should have and require a common framework and a common definition of what do we mean and what are the keys. So that is what 37000 brings, and it is international in nature in that it really was developed by all these different organizations. So the role of ISO, Nadita already spoke to that, and you can see that it had a lot of participation, both participating members as well as observing members. It is fundamental to ISO's overall strategy, which is to making lives easier, safer, and better by including all voices, meeting specific needs, and thereby enabling the world to use standards everywhere, because there are a lot of drivers of change at the moment, okay, that are creating a lot of aspects. So it is enabling us to plan and to organizations to make plans for achieving also the Sustainable Development Goals, and it is contributing directly to environmental, economic, and social dimensions of organizations. ISO as a whole has also committed to climate action, and that is one of the reasons why this standards, as well as all new and all the standards that we currently deal with, as well as all new standards, will be aligned with to support the climate agenda and the goals, because only together can we achieve that. ISO is also providing an overview of all the Sustainable Development Goals and how many standards there are that are focusing explicitly on these dimensions. And for example, the ones that we're speaking about today are part of the core set of standards within peace and strong and justice and strong institutions. But we are contributing to a number of other standards as well. Okay, by adopting the standards, you are installing integrated governance. Okay, and integrated governance through the standards gives you the clarity, consistency, and the requisite differentiation across an integrated governance framework. So for a lot of the time, people think that boards are the only ones governing, but the governing body, which is one form of the board is one form of a governing body, is only one part in many organizations, and there are others. And public sector organizations are very clear and experience it every day that, for example, the member stakeholders. So we even introduced new terminology so that state bodies, family-based organizations, and many others have consistent terminology now to refer to these different actors. And so, for example, it is not very useful to think of owners because it's both technically inappropriate as well as not generally valid. But it is true to say that all organizations do have members, and member stakeholders do have a special relationship. And in some organizations, that takes the form of shareholders, for example. But in other organizations, for example, in public authorities, it takes the role of the minister, and then how is the ministry related to this? All of that is clarified and has clarity and coherence and consistency. So we have clarity on purpose, we have clarity on stakeholders, we have clarity also on what constitutes value. We are integrating purpose with the natural environment and social systems. So we cannot say that an organization is well governed unless it is also governing ethically and with good stewardship, and thereby of the resources that it is engaging, all kinds of resources that it is engaging, and therefore contributing to achieving its purpose and generating value. So we spoke about also the governing body. So we have the governing body, but there are other governing groups. So for example, if you are in an organization, a family organization, for example, let's say a large family organization with several divisions. So then you have, for example, the family council has an important role to play, and in this, and even though they are maybe not shareholders, but what are they in this relationship? So now ISO 37000 gives you the clear terminology for how to refer to all these groups who have legitimate important roles to play in the governance, and what do the division heads do, and how are they related to governance. So ISO 37000 provides that guidance. It also provides guidance on what is expected of governing bodies in relation, and others involved in governance, but let's say in this case specifically with the governing body in relation to the strategy of organizations, and how can an governing body direct and engage with the strategy without interfering. Very importantly is the introduction of the definition even of what a control system is. And I will review that, I'll come to it later, and how that is related to assurance and how that is related to risk governance. So all these terms that are in all our organizations every day, often there's a lot of confusion, and not least because the terminology is unclear, but also because actually the way the system works and how things are put together is often not very clear and is not covered in great depth in many of the guidance documents that otherwise exist. And the importance of value, ethics, and how we measure performance. All of these topics are often not very clearly specified in existing documents pertaining to governance. I covered already the parts about the governance architecture. The standard, since its publication, has received a lot of endorsements, which you can see on the website for the ISO standard, and a lot of important organizations in relation to governance sphere have endorsed it and are promoting it. And so I will give you a few of an overview. And so the most important element is is all summarized in this view here. And then we'll dive into two sections, so what we have here is we have a primary principle, which is the purpose principle. We have 4 foundational governance principles. So purpose is the primary principle. All organizations have a purpose. And that purpose needs to be interpreted to understand what does value mean? So what constitutes value? How do we generate value? How do we oversee value? And how we sustain value? How do we distribute value over time? And so every organization requires a value generation model for how that is being done, on the basis of which you can then derive and create strategic results and goals that should be generated, for which you can generate a strategic plan, and which you can then steer, both from management as well as the strategy overall, and how the governing body is engaged in that. And then you have the oversight system, which includes a system of internal control and an assurance system. And then you have accountability principle, which is both accountability within the organization as by the organization to external stakeholders. And then to be able to achieve this, we have 6 enabling principles. And these are stakeholder engagement, is leadership, data and decisions, risk governance, social responsibility, viability and performance over time. And the result of this are effective performance. So the organization is performing and achieving the results that it is seeking to. So it's creating the solutions and in effective ways. It is ethical, that is, it is consistent with the expectations of stakeholders, and it is responsible in its stewardship. Okay, and okay, I think I need to pick up the pace a little bit, so when it comes to purpose, the governing body is responsible for defining and elaborating a meaningful, relevant organizational purpose. As the reason for the organization is this, it gives detailed guidance on relative practice. Sorry, and the standard gives relevant guidance on it. So a lot of organizations are now saying organizations should have purpose, but how do you generate this and how do you work with it? So the standard gives you guidance on that. Then when it comes to value generation, I already explained that we need a value generation model because only then do we have the basis of really innovation, since we now know what we're trying to innovate towards. And since we are defining what value constitutes and purposeful or end values, the ultimate values, a lot of organizations will then suddenly realize that this value that they're generating is not internal value to themselves or the returns from effectively providing solutions, but the value is actually that the large part of the value is the difference that they make in people's lives or to the natural environment. And if that is really their purpose, as it is, since that is the ultimate value, then organizations discover that they need to actually collaborate with others. And so therefore, it becomes an automatic part that organizations are collaborating largely with other organizations. And strategy, it gives guidance on strategies for how to direct and how to engage with strategy in accordance to the value generation model, and how to actively and dynamically steer the strategies. So there are a lot of regulators, for example, the Financial Stability Board lays great emphasis on governing bodies being actively involved in understanding and shaping the strategy of the organizations. And at the same time, of course, these governing bodies ought not to and should not to, are not expected to interfere with the strategy. So how do you do that? The standard gives detailed guidance and provides about 9 different levers that governing bodies can use in that process. And accountability, already covered this, so it's both internal accountability and external accountability. The clarity that is often missing, though, for organizations is that the governing body is responsible for and accountable to the organization as a whole. And of course, it's almost obvious, but it is in practice not the case that all governing body members understand that they're accountable to the organization. And then what is the organization? Well, it's for its purpose. So therefore, you are accountable to the organization for enabling it to achieve its purpose. And so this clarity is very important. And oversight, I will go into a little bit more details on oversight later on. And I've already outlined the fact that it needs to have an internal control system, an assurance system, and an effective delegation system for that to work. The enabling principles, I've laid them out before, and we start with stakeholder engagement. So that is about why and governing bodies need to understand, and the other people involved in governance, why and how they need to engage with stakeholders to achieve that and to be able to achieve their purpose, and how to engage and become effective in decision-making. And the leadership. So the governing body should lead by example to create positive value-based culture. It sets the tone for others. It engenders trust, mutual cooperation with the organization stakeholders. And data and decisions is also a topic that is often not covered, even though it is becoming one of the most pressing topics around the world in terms of what governing bodies need to do in relation to this. And so the governing body should see and recognize data as a strategic and valuable resource for decision-making. And the standards provide guidance in this direction, and also provides guidance relating to decision-making processes and aspects to take into consideration for ensuring that these are ethical, responsible, and effective. And risk governance, of course, is given all the uncertainty that currently prevails. Risk is and always has been prevalent throughout the organization and all parts of the organizations. But now the scale and the dimensions of change uncertainty are putting many of the organizational purpose, achievement objectives, and strategic objectives at risk. And so governing purpose is a very important, governing the organization so that it can achieve its purpose is absolutely critical. And so the the 37,000 is foundational about the role that governing bodies plays in this, okay? And it's three aspects. It is to set the tone, to shape the culture. It is the systematic assessment of risks and the definition of risk criteria, in particular, appetite for risk and risk limits. So these are core elements, what all governing bodies need to be able to do. And the governing body assesses, treats, monitors, and communicates the nature of risks that it itself is facing and the organization collectively, okay? So it is a lot of important work and important guidance that is necessary for that. And we already emphasized the importance of this societal responsibility and engaging with stakeholders so as to be able to act in transparent ways and aligned with social expectations and within parameters of acceptable behavior, okay? And then there is the principle 11, which is about the viability and performance over time. And so here it is absolutely critical for governing bodies to identify, describe, and assess the key resources and the value generation system that it depends on. So what are the resources and how do they fit together and what role do they play? So governing bodies need to be clear about that. The second question is that governing bodies need to be clear on and work with is how do these components, these capitals, these resources, these key resources, how they interrelate and how are they used over time? And the third aspect is how does the organization then ensure that the organization protects and restores these key resources so that it can create value over time because it's dependent on these resources. So these are very explicit guidance elements that enable together with the other principles, enable organizations to contribute to sustainability and become sustainable themselves. Okay, I think that those are some of the main highlights from 37,000. So it is a global benchmark that provides a compass, that it's a tool, and it allows organizations to create transparency, reduce complexity, and build trust. I think that we can clarify any question that you may have, but I think I should give way to back to Nadita to cover and to Andrea to cover other aspects of our work.
Thank you, Axel. So I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but I will start sharing my presentation so that we can look at the 37,002. So I will go pretty quickly in terms of the overview and look at the importance of anti-bribery management systems and some of the key elements. So the importance of anti-bribery management systems. Bribery has had a significant effect world over, especially on developing countries. Corruption could be understood as bribery, extortion, kickbacks, nepotism, conflicts of interest. So bribery being one subset is a significant risk to organization. So just in terms of some statistics, 53% of cases involve corporate management or CEOs. 57% of cases involve bribes to obtain public procurement contracts. 80 individuals were imprisoned after foreign bribery conviction. So again, we get the sense of there will be international demands for improved transparency, accountability. In terms of financial figures, according to the World Economic Forum in 2018, 5% of global GDP was lost due to corruption. So clearly, bribery would be one of the significant risks that we need to address as we strive to improve sustainability, improve the economic performance of our country. In terms of some additional statistics from Transparency International, the Corruption Perception Index, which essentially looks at perceived corruption in the public sector. Based on the map, the darker shade would indicate where there is significant corruption being perceived according to the index. And just in terms of wondering where Trinidad and Tobago is, the global average is around 43, and our ranking as Trinidad and Tobago is 41 out of 100. In terms of ranking, 82 out of 180 countries. So given the global average 43, we are on par. However, the performance based on corruption is something significant for the country. A score of 0 means that a country is perceived as highly corrupt. Some of the examples of countries that perform well based on the Corruption Perception Index: Denmark, Finland, New Zealand. In terms of the countries that rank at the lower end of the spectrum, countries Somalia, Syria, South Sudan. So there's a clear link between corruption and the level of development in the country. And given the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been increased demand for transparency, accountability issues, social and environmental sustainability issues to be addressed as well. And this is one of the main driving force for the development of ISO 37001. It covers anti-bribery management systems. And some of the key aspects that we would look at is exactly what is an anti-bribery management system? What does the standard require? Some key elements of the standard: leadership, commitment, top management, policies, a compliance function, how to address conflicts of interest, the operational aspects of a system, investigating and dealing with bribery. ISO 27000, it is a management system standard. So if you're familiar with ISO 9000, quality management, the elements are essentially the same, very similar requirements. The anti-bribery management system is designed to help an organization establish, implement, maintain, and improve an anti-bribery compliance program. The key benefits that we need to take into account with a standard like this would be to improve trust, guidance for shareholders, promote investment, avoid conflicts of interest. And Axel would have highlighted the issue of risk governance. So dealing with the risk and the damage being involved in bribery is something that has to be addressed within the standard. Also managing reputational risk. So as we would have seen, there's significant costs when there is corruption, and corruption can take place within the public sector as well as the private sector. For developing countries, corruption can lead to resources being diverted, and therefore there's a strong linkage with social inequity and inequality. And as we strive to focus on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, there's a clear role for these governance standards, ISO 27001, providing critical support in achieving some of the principles Axel would have highlighted previously. The standard itself includes a series of measures and controls that represent global anti-bribery good practice. And I would have mentioned ISO 9001, the very familiar quality management standard, and it looks at the organization and its context, customer requirements, the need and expectations of relevant interested parties, as well as the delivery of the product and service. And in this context, we're looking at the performance of an anti-bribery management system. I should mention as well that it is premised on the Plan, Do, Check, Act, the PDCA cycle, very familiar to us in the context of management systems. And to cover what bribery is, it is the offering, promising, giving, accepting, or soliciting of any undue advantage of any value. And value can be in financial terms or non-financial. For example, if there's a trade-off directly or indirectly, and irrespective of location, in violation of applicable law as an inducement or reward for a person acting or refraining from acting in relation to the performance of that person's duty. The standard itself provides the requirements, and also it has guidance for establishing the entire system for anti-bribery. It looks at the implementation aspect in terms of what is required for support and operation, and also the very critical review systems. So the management review, the conduct of audits. Who can use this standard? So similar to the 7,000 standard, this standard is very flexible and it can be used by organizations of all types and sizes, large, small, medium, public sector organizations, private sector, NGOs, can be used in any country. And it is up to each organization to determine what is called in the standard, the context of the organization. So what are the internal and external drivers that impact on the organization's performance? So a lot of flexibility available, but there are some key aspects that would need to be addressed in the standard. In terms of the scope, as we mentioned, it covers the requirements and guidance for establishing, implementing, maintaining, reviewing, and improving the anti-bribery management system. And one of the key aspects of the management systems, the standards developed by ISO, is that they can be integrated. So for example, it can be integrated with your quality management system, your environmental management system, your information management system. So it allows that degree of integration and flexibility. So I would like to touch on the application of the standard. So bribery can take place at different levels. It can happen in the public, private, not-for-profit sector. It can look at bribery within the organization by the organization's personnel acting on behalf of the organization. It can also take place by business associates acting on behalf of the organization or for its benefit, the organization itself. It can look at the personnel. It could also look at direct and indirect bribery, example, a bribe offered or accepted through or by a third party. I wanted to touch on what is called the high-level structure for the ISO management systems, and you'll see that there are common elements, the scope, normative references. I would have touched on the context of the organization, leadership, planning, support, operation, performance, evaluation, improvement. So as I indicated previously, it follows the other management systems produced by ISO. This is what we call the high-level structure, and new or enhanced measures can be integrated within the existing systems that an organization may have. So essentially, you do not have to start from scratch. It would mean addressing what is required for anti-bribery measures and the monitoring and performance. In the standard itself, the anti-bribery management system, there has to be measures designed to identify and evaluate the risk of and to prevent, detect, and respond to bribery. So one of the key points in the standard, it is recognized that you cannot completely eliminate the risk of bribery. However, it presents a system to help manage and mitigate, minimize, avoid the risk of bribery within the organization. And the standard also speaks about creating a culture of anti-bribery within the organization. So the establishment of policies, training of individuals, having a system to detect bribery if it is perceived, and to determine whether there is actually a breach of the standard. And a key point in the standard itself is that the management system has to be reasonable and proportionate. So you have to take into account a lot of factors. So going back to the context of the organization, size, scale, location, the culture, the internal, external issues that affect the organization, and also the establishment of different processes needed according to the requirements of the standard. And that issue of continually reviewing and looking at improvements across the organization is critical. So we've been talking about anti-bribery system, and the definition of bribery is one that can vary across countries. Some countries may have anti-bribery legislation in place. The standard itself provides a generic definition of bribery so that it can be applied across different organizations, different countries. But the standard does not take the place of law. The standard can complement the legislation that may exist. And where there's no legislation, it provides an example of good practice, and it is an effective tool to help manage that bribery risk within the organization. So looking at transparency across the supply chain, communication issues, improving efficiency, and a proactive risk management approach would be significant elements of the system to help manage the risk. Within the standard itself, it mentions leadership and commitment. And Axel would have spoken about the difference between the governing body management. And in the event that there is a governing body, they're responsible for approving the organization's anti-bribery policy, ensuring that strategy and policy are aligned, reviewing information about the operation and the content of the anti-bribery management system, and also requiring that adequate and appropriate resources are provided for the effective operation, and also provide reasonable oversight over the entire implementation. Now, in the case where there may not be a governing body, then top management would have the responsibility to ensure that these requirements are met. And within the standard itself, there are some additional responsibilities for top management. So to ensure that the ABMS is established, so looking at the policy, the key performance indicators, objectives to address bribery risk, looking at the integration of the ABMS into the organization's processes, making sure and ensuring that there are adequate and appropriate resources, issues such as communication, the appropriate design of the entire system would be critical. And of course, personnel would have to be provided to support the effective implementation of the anti-bribery management system. I would have highlighted the need for an anti-bribery culture, looking at continual improvement, and as a part of the processes, also having reporting procedures if there are cases where bribery is suspected, and also to help in detecting whether bribery has actually happened. And as part of the entire system, and to ensure that the standard is being fair and the system is appropriately designed, the top management would need to ensure that if a report has to be made, that there will be no retaliation, or the employee would not experience discrimination or disciplinary action for making a report, made in good faith, of course, that there might be a possible violation of the anti-bribery policy. And top management would also need to report to the governing body of the progress and the success performance of the anti-bribery management system, and if there are any serious allegations or systemic bribery happening within the organization. So this slide provides an overview of what this standard requires, and again, very similar to some of the considerations in having a quality management system. So an anti-bribery policy, management, leadership, commitment, responsibility. So in ensuring that personnel would need to know who's responsible for what. The proactive risk management requires risk assessments to be done. Personnel would have to be trained, and there would need to be control measures in place. We will touch in another slide, due diligence. Now, given that we're dealing with bribery, and a lot of the allegations of bribery deal with financial inducements, there would be financial, commercial, and contractual controls. But based on my previous slide, there are also non-financial issues that would need to be taken into account. And there would need to be a proper reporting system so that the personnel can be monitored, systems, processes evaluated. There has to be a robust system for investigating any claims of violation and a review system. And to conclude on this, there would also need to be that corrective action, continual improvement aspect, which is a critical part of a management system standard. I wanted to touch on the anti-bribery policy. And essentially, this is where the organization would outline its commitment. So it would have to state explicitly that bribery is prohibited. It would have to define what is considered bribery. And again, going back to the issue of culture, there may be cultural norms, and it would be very interesting to define bribery in the particular country so that it is appropriate to the norms of the society. If there are any anti-bribery laws, that should also be highlighted. And there has to be a properly defined framework where the performance objectives are set and there is a mechanism for the establishment of these objectives and how they would be reviewed and then how they would also be evaluated. Overall, there has to be organizational commitment to satisfy the anti-bribery management system. And in training and ensuring that employees are invested and part of the anti-bribery culture, there has to be a mechanism to encourage that concerns be raised. So again, the point about not having any possible retaliation, discrimination if concerns are aired, the commitment to continual improvement. And one of the key aspects and unique aspects of this particular management system would be the anti-bribery compliance function that we will touch on a little later on in the presentation. Within the standard, it clearly defines what is required for this anti-bribery compliance function. So the function has a responsibility and authority for several elements. So first off, the design, implementation, operation, and improvement of the anti-bribery management system, ensuring that the system conforms to the requirements of the standard, as well as providing guidance, advice on the management systems and any issues related to bribery, reporting on the performance of the anti-bribery management system to the governing body. And again, if there's no governing body, then that responsibility would be now top management and any other compliance functions as appropriate. Axel would have spoken about several other standards. The intent of these governance standards are that they all can be fully integrated and complement each other. In terms of what is required for the compliance function, it has to be properly and adequately resourced and assigned to someone who has the competence, so the expertise to deal with anti-bribery. And a key aspect of compliance with regard to anti-bribery is reporting back, so direct and prompt access to the governing body, if any, and top management. And a point to note is that this compliance function can be outsourced. So it can be assigned to persons external to the organization. Within the standard, it provides some requirements in terms of if the function is being outsourced to someone external, it provides some control measures for that as well. So again, a unique aspect of this particular standard is the concept of due diligence, and where there's more than low risk. So depending on how you do your risk assessment, say low, medium, high, if it is higher than low, so medium or high, the organization has to do several things. So it shall assess the nature and the extent of the bribery risk in relation to specific transactions, projects, activities. The business associate is also a new term used within the standard, and personnel fall in within those categories. So there has to be an assessment, there has to be an investigation, and the organization has also to include any due diligence requirements to obtain sufficient information to assess the risk. The due diligence shall be updated, and it has to be done at a defined frequency so that changes and new information would be taken into account. So within this standard, there is also a definition of due diligence. So it is the process to further assess the nature and the extent of the bribery risk and to help organizations make a decision or decisions in relation to specific transactions, projects, activities, business associates, and personnel. So it would be very important to have that process defined. It would be one of the key elements of the anti-bribery management system. Given the nature of bribery, and it could be financial, it could be non-financial, there could be some type of trade-off, we would have to examine conflicts of interest. And within the standard, there's a definition of what is considered a conflict of interest. So a situation where business, financial, family, political, or personal interests could interfere with the judgment of persons in carrying out their duties for the organization. So within the standard, there are several elements or requirements where conflict of interest would be mentioned. And one example is under delegated decision-making. So where top management delegates to personnel the authority for making decisions in relation to where there's more than a low risk of bribery, the organization shall establish and maintain a decision-making process or set of controls so that the decision maker would be appropriate and free of actual or potential perceived conflicts of interest. So there has to be that type of control system process properly defined within the ABMS to ensure that the conflicts of interest are identified and properly managed and potentially avoided. It also uses the term should, and Axel would have highlighted the difference between shall and should. And there is some recommendations within the guidance part of the standard where it says that the organization should identify and evaluate the risk of internal and external conflicts of interest. The organization should clearly inform all personnel of their duty to report any actual or potential conflict of interest. And again, going back to the definition, family, financial, or other connection directly or indirectly related to their line of work. And it also goes further to say that there should be a record of any circumstance of actual or potential conflicts of interest and whether any actions were taken to mitigate the conflict. And this would be very important for the risk assessment that I would have mentioned earlier. And Axel would have touched on the importance of risk governance as part of the overall governance system for the organization. Now, we can't go into all the details of the standard, so I encourage everyone to take a look at it. It should be easy to understand if you're already familiar with the ISO 9001 standard. And I would also recommend that if you haven't looked at the quality management system standard, that you should take a look and look at how these standards can be fully integrated. So there's a lot of guidance on 9001. There's also a lot of guidance from ISO in terms of this particular standard, the Anti-Bribery Management System. ISO has a very useful handbook that is available for purchase from TTBS, so it can be accessed via TTBS. And in the operation clause, there are several different considerations, and in no particular order. The anti-bribery commitment is critical. It also looks at how to address gifts, hospitality, donations, and similar benefits. And sometimes these benefits are not financial, so any possible trade-offs that might be considered as bribery. Managing the inadequacy of the anti-bribery controls is also highlighted. The issue of raising concerns, and we would have mentioned that as part of the culture of the organization, how to handle investigations and deal with bribery, the operational planning and control, so how the system is set up, how it is resourced, how it is monitored, the concept of the due diligence, the financial controls, the non-financial controls. All of these are covered under the clause that looks at operations. So it is an extensive list of requirements, and it all forms the core of what the anti-bribery management system has to consider. So I wanted to touch on investigating and dealing with bribery. So the standard is pretty expansive in this area. And again, the management systems, they require a lot of procedures. Some of them would have to be properly documented. So there is a need to look at assessments and where appropriate investigation of anti-bribery or violation of the anti-bribery policy or the management system. So there has to be a reporting, detection, or how to deal with the perception of bribery, require appropriate action in the event that the investigation reveals any incidents of bribery or violation of the policy or the system. There has to be the concept of allowing the investigations to happen properly. So investigators need to be empowered and enabled. So it is all part of, what we would normally look at in terms of who has responsibility for what part of the system. Cooperation in the investigation require that the status and results are reported to the anti-bribery compliance function and other compliance functions as appropriate. So Andrea is going to look at the compliance management system, and that has also its own set of requirements, again, very similar to the quality management system and all the other management system standards. And again, in doing an investigation, the investigation itself has to be confidential, and the outputs of the investigation are confidential. Now, in terms of reporting, the report has to be directed back to top management and the governing body, as we would have indicated earlier. And the investigation shall be carried out and reported to personnel who are not part of the role or function being investigated. So the concept of outsourcing some of the compliance function is also covered here, where the organization can appoint a business associate to conduct the investigation to ensure that level of independence, impartiality, and report the results to the relevant persons. So a lot of requirements in terms of how to handle the investigation and deal with allegations of bribery. In concluding, the management review shall review the organization's anti-bribery management system at planned intervals to ensure its continuing suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness. And in terms of how will this standard benefit an organization, based on our earlier discussion, it provides minimum requirements and support and guidance for implementing or benchmarking an anti-bribery management system. It provides assurance to management, investors, employees, customers, and other stakeholders that an organization is taking a reasonable approach to mitigating the bribery risk, and it provides evidence in the event of an investigation that an organization has been reasonable in preventing bribery. So there are lots of benefits. I mean, the loss of investor confidence due to bribery is a significant risk to any organization, and very critical that proper systems are set up to deal with the risk of bribery. Some of the key takeaways from the session. So the anti-bribery management system can help a company comply with its legal obligations, especially if there's legislation, and demonstrate commitment to integrity. We have spoken significantly about risk and a proactive risk management approach. So it helps avoid or mitigate the costs, risks, and damage of involvement in bribery, promote trust and confidence in business dealings, and enhance a company's reputation. It shows that an organization can proactively address bribery, and via the management system, there is proper systems, procedures, resourcing for an organization to address the risk of bribery, promote the anti-bribery culture, and demonstrate leadership commitment to a culture of integrity, transparency, openness, and compliance. And again, all important points for our trade activities, our economic development. We would have seen from the graph of the corruption perception index, there's a significant correlation to a high degree of corruption to the level of development of a country. And it has to be that proper systems are put in place to help mitigate the risk, promote the development of our country and the organizations and the overall society. So that is the end of my presentation. I will now turn you back to Axel. So I'll stop sharing my screen and Axel will speak about the whistleblowing management standard now. So Axel, I turn it over to you.
Okay, great, thank you. I will provide an overview of the whistleblowing management standard. And so this is about the act of whistleblowing, which is about reporting suspected wrongdoing or the risk of wrongdoing, okay? And the standard provides guidance for establishing, implementing, maintaining, and improving a whistleblowing management system. And one of the advantages of all these standards, these management systems are that they are management system standards. So they provide a comprehensive set, if I can complement some of the aspects and questions from the chat. And in doing so, you generate certain outcomes, okay? So there is reporting, increased reporting. It encourages and facilitates reporting of wrongdoing. It supports and protects whistleblowers if you implement such a system. It leads to action to ensure that these reports are actually being dealt with in a proper and timely manner. And it therefore then also leads to improvements in organizational culture, governance, and the prevention of wrongdoing. We can see this also in a graphical way where we have the classic plan, do, check, act, driven by leadership and with support within a context that is established, okay? So you will see that all management system standards are following this kind of structure and therefore are easy to read and easy to understand and easy to work together with. So the scope of the standard deals with receiving, assessing, addressing, and concluding whistleblowing management cases. It introduces specific terminology, again, so that we have common language with which to work. It guides also organizations to assess their context and to determine the extent to which they want their whistleblowing management system, what they want it to cover, what number of processes they want to be included in this process. It provides guidance for the leadership, the governing body, to set objectives, to monitor top management. Oops, sorry, that was one step too far. Approving policy, demonstrating commitment to the policy and the system, and importantly, there are details for how to do these aspects, to how to receive and review information, and how to allocate and assign resources so that we can then also exercise oversight, okay? Now, it does this also by providing, useful guidance, okay? So a lot of the time, organizations get stuck in drafting these policies, for example, you know, or they just copy and paste something from somewhere else. So one of the useful aspects here is that you get concrete guidance for these other topics to be included. And so both the drafters as well as the governing body and others can be quite confident that they're covering all the requisite dimensions. And it gives guidance for how you should develop it, how it can be, you ensure compatibility, availability, how you communicate it, and how you review this process. And it gives guidance on the roles and responsibilities. Again, a very practical step that people often stumble across when they design their systems. It provides guidance for planning. How do you assess the risks? How do you create the objectives and how you plan to achieve them? And it also provides guidance for how you can support such a system. So the resources, the competencies, awareness, training, people, communication, and what documented information you must maintain. Then it also gives you guidance on the specific operations of such a system. So here you can see how the standard is broken down into the different aspects of the standard relating to the system in operation. And so it gives you this overview for how the system works and how the different parts of the standard, which parts are described where. Also guidance for performance management and evaluation, and how the management reviews it, as well as how to improve. So what do you do with non-conformative and with corrective action, and how do you conform and improve over time? And I think I've covered this topic in record time. Not that it doesn't deserve more, but I want to make sure that we also have time for the compliance management system, because all these parts work together. And if you have enough time, I can give an example for how these things work together. Andrea, do you want to go next?
So while Andrea comes on board, I will just do her introduction, Axel. So Andrea has over 25 years of experience in the areas of quality management, auditing, operations management, business risk management, internal controls, and governance in a number of sectors, including education, manufacturing, oil and gas, and printing and packaging. She has spent the last 14 years providing management consultancy and support services to small and medium clients. Andrea is also a key member of our National Mirror Committee, and she's also a member of ISO TC 309. So Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I was muted before. So thanks, Axel. Thanks, Nidita, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'll be covering as quickly as I can the Compliance Management System Standard ISO 37301. All right. And the references I would have used would be the standard itself and an article that I found online on what organizations need to know about the CMS standard by Mortitz Homan. All right, so as a brief introduction, ISO 37301 is an international standard for compliance management systems that was published in April of 2021. It provides a certifiable global benchmark for compliance systems. And this first issue cancels and replaces ISO 19600 to 2014, which was until now, or when the standard was published, the recognized international standard for best practice in compliance management. The key difference between the ISO 19600 and this standard is that 19600 was a type B management standard, which means it only gave recommendations and therefore it was not certifiable. ISO 37301 is a type A standard, and so it provides requirements in addition to recommendations for implementation. So it is a certification standard and is therefore certifiable by accredited auditors. Many of the core elements of ISO 19600 have been maintained and incorporated in the new standards. So for any organization that would have implemented those guidelines, they would already have made a strong headway in complying with the new standard or the revised standard. As of most management system standards, the standard is applicable to all types of organizations, irrespective of their size, industry, risk exposure, or global footprint. And notably, this standard is flexible in its requirements and recognizes that each organization is responsible for determining the needs of their own compliance management system and how to ultimately implement the recommended practices. All right, so what is compliance? Compliance can be described as the ongoing process and the outcome of an organization meeting its obligations. And these obligations are requirements that an organization has to mandatorily comply with, as well as those that they may voluntarily choose to comply with. So mandatory requirements may be legal or regulatory, industry codes, or even standards set by the organization itself. An example for, let's say, a tertiary or post-secondary training institution locally would be the registration requirements set by the Accreditation Council of Trinidad and Tobago. These are requirements and standards with which these institutions must comply in order to be able to operate. So they are mandatory requirements. Examples of voluntary requirements would be requirements such as the ISO 9001 that Nadita mentioned, or 14,000 for organizations that choose to use these as a basis for their quality management or environmental systems. STORE requirements used for pre-qualifying contractors in the energy and energy-related industries are another example of voluntary local requirements. And now we're going to look at why compliance management. Compliance management is a requirement for long-term success, and organizations that aim for long-term success need to establish and maintain a culture of compliance that considers the needs and expectations of interested parties, or stakeholders as we call them commonly. Compliance can be made or is made sustainable by embedding it, that is compliance, in the culture of an organization and in the behavior and attitude of people looking for it. So one of the objectives of this standard, or this document, is to assist organizations with developing and spreading a positive culture of compliance. And this compliance culture is a composite of the values, ethics, beliefs, and conduct that exist throughout an organization and that interacts with the organization's structures and control systems to produce behavioral norms that are conducive to meeting all of the organization's compliance obligations. So a key part of what the standard hopes to do is to help organizations embed that culture of compliance. All right, so some of the benefits of establishing a compliance management system. An effective organization-wide compliance management system enables an organization to demonstrate its commitment to comply with relevant laws, regulatory requirements, industry codes, and organizational standards, as well as standards of good governance and generally accepted best practices. It also helps them to demonstrate their commitment to ethics and community expectations. So for the organization, it also improves business opportunities and sustainability, protects and enhances the organization's reputation and credibility, while taking the expectations of interested parties or their stakeholders into account. And it demonstrates the organization's commitment to managing its compliance risk effectively and efficiently. All right, it also helps to increase the confidence of third parties in the organization's capacity to achieve sustained success while minimizing the risk of a contravention occurring, which would have with it attendant cost and reputational damage. All right, so ISO 37301 describes in detail how to configure a compliance management system in order to satisfy international legal norms and regulation. And it also stipulates compliance with social and ethical values. This standard, as the one that Nadita went through, also draws on the established plan, do, check, act cycle, which requires that the compliance management system operates within a continuous improvement cycle. So again, I should have mentioned, those familiar with quality management and also with other management system standards would be familiar with this plan, do, check, act cycle that we use. One thing to note is that the compliance management system is expected to be based on the principles of good governance, proportionality, integrity, transparency, accountability, and sustainability. And ISO 37301 encourages companies to focus on a system-wide implementation of an organization-wide compliance system. So this system is going to take into consideration all the requirements that the organization is required to meet and ensure that there's cohesive compliance. In terms of the system, it's all nicely summed up in the diagram at the right. And I'm not sure, hopefully you'll see my mouse. But the inputs to the cycle are the objectives and, the objectives and the principles that I just mentioned, as well as the bottom, you will see, along with the organizational context, which is at the bottom here in this arrow. Leadership, governance, and culture sit at the center of the activities. And these are expanded on in the clause requirements of the standard. And we're going to discuss these next. You would notice in this outer circle here, it speaks to the establishment, development, and implementation, etc., maintaining and improving of the system. All right. So what are the requirements of this standard? The document can be thought of having three main sections: an introduction, the requirements, which cover the 10 clauses that follow the high-level management system standards structure that Nadita would have also mentioned, and which is the same structure used by all management systems. So those are the 10 clauses. And again, as she would have mentioned, this facilitates integration of this management standard with other management standards. But also included in this standard, because it's also a guidance standard, is an Annex A, which provides guidance for use of the standard. And this annex is numbered. The numbering in this annex is similar to that for the requirements, which makes it easy for someone to find additional guidance on the various clauses and the requirements under clause 1 to 10. Okay, so the first three clauses are the scope, normative references, and terms and definition. And we would have discussed what the scope would have defined already, which is that the document provides requirements and guidelines for establishing, development, implementing, evaluating, maintaining, and improving an effective compliance management system. And this is normally what you'd find in all management system standards in terms of the scope. And it also reinforces that it's applicable to all types of organizations, regardless of the size and type and nature of their activities, whether public, private, or nonprofit sector. This particular document doesn't have any normative references. However, users can refer to the bibliography at the end of the document for other information and other standards that are relevant to compliance. And then in clause 3, we have some terms and definitions that are used in the document, which I'm going through now. So clause 4, context of the organization. This requirement has 6 subclauses, and the intent of this clause is that organizations would establish a high level, for example, a strategic understanding of the important issues that can affect their compliance management system, their compliance, and this is the clause that also indicates or says that you should develop a compliance management system. So it involves understanding, first understanding the internal and external issues that are relevant to the organization's purpose and their ability to impact the results of the compliance management system once it's established. It involves understanding the needs and the expectations of the relevant stakeholders and determining from that which requirements would be addressed by a compliance management system. So that leads directly into determining the scope of the system. And the scope really is intended to clarify the main compliance risks that the organization faces. And it will provide the boundaries to which the system would apply. So it will clearly state what is included and what is not included in the compliance management system. All right, the other 2 clauses, sub-clauses deal with, as I said, what I've mentioned before, implementing and in continually improving the compliance management system and ensuring that the organization, apart from this systematically identifies whatever compliance obligations they have that may result from its activities or changes to its activities, the outputs from its activities, which will be the products and services or whatever other outputs it may have, and the impact of these on its operations. Right. Then we go to clause 5, which deals with leadership, and effective compliance requires an active commitment from the governing body and top management that should permeate the whole organization. So the standard lists many ways that leadership can demonstrate their commitment, starting with active and visible support for establishing and maintaining the compliance management system. And this includes formally approving a compliance policy, ensuring that compliance objectives are established, and promoting the compliance culture that we spoke about earlier. Management is expected in showing leadership and the governing body that they would take responsibility and demonstrate by their words and their actions that the organization will meet compliance obligations. They'll also ensure that resources are available, commitment to compliance, and the importance of conforming to system requirements. It is vital that for the success of the system, that the governing body and top management clearly and visibly demonstrate their commitment to achieving the goals of the system. And then we have planning. The planning clause addresses planning for the system, which should be performed at a strategic level, and it includes anticipating potential scenarios and consequences that can impact compliance management. So this is where the organization would perform a risk assessment, and using the results of their compliance risk assessment, they should plan how they will address any undesired effects before they occur and how they will benefit from favorable conditions or circumstances. It also includes determining how to incorporate actions that they determine need to be taken into business activities and processes. Then we have resources, and the organization needs to determine, and it talks about shall here, determine and provide the resources needed for the establishment, implementation, and continual improvement of the compliance management system. And resources include financial, human, and technical resources, as well as access to external advice and specialized skills, infrastructure, professional development, technology, and contemporary material, and compliance management and legal obligations that the organization would need. With respect to competence, the term competence means the ability to apply knowledge and skills to achieve intended results. And competence requires that persons have the requisite knowledge, experience, and skill to function and to perform their duties in an effective manner. So the organization needs to determine what the expertise and knowledge is necessary for personnel to fulfill their task. And one of the things with this section is it specifies that the organization should undertake due diligence when hiring staff, so which includes ensuring that they do their reference and their background checks as part of their compliance responsibility. 7.3, which deals with awareness, involves ensuring that the compliance policies are made accessible and that it's made available to all staff and that all personnel, and that they understand what is required of them. 4 deals with communication, 7.4, and the organization needs to determine the internal and external communications that are relevant to the compliance management system. And this should include a practical approach to external communication, which targets all interested parties or stakeholders, and it should allocate appropriate resources and personnel with the relevant knowledge to coordinate and facilitate regulatory interaction as required. So where the organization has regulatory requirements, appropriate personnel should be assigned to deal with the regulators. And I know I need to kind of hustle. 7.5 deals with documented information, and it gives the requirements for managing documented information that the organization has to use, and this would include documented information required by the standard. So for example, the scope under standard 1.3 indicates that the scope is something that must be documented. The compliance obligations under clause 1.5 and documented information must be maintained of investigations under clause 8.4. All right. So in terms of operation, there are 4 subclauses under this. The organization has to plan, implement, and control the processes needed to meet the requirements and to implement the actions determined and the actions and controls needed to manage the its compliance obligations and associate compliance risks. And these controls must be periodically reviewed and tested to ensure that they continue to be effective. And testing controls simply means that you conduct an exercise to see whether the control behaves as you intend and whether it's actually effective in reducing the impact or likelihood of a risk that you would have identified. The organization is also required to maintain a process that would encourage and enable the reporting of attempted, suspected of, or actual violations of the compliance policy or compliance obligations. And this process needs not only to be accessible throughout the organization, but the reports generated must be treated confidentially, and the process should protect those making the reports. All right, so this is where we have breaches in compliance. That the organization may be breaching, let's say, I don't know, statutory requirements or other requirements. In terms to follow up on these reports, however, there must be a process to assess, evaluate, and investigate and close out reports. So the investigation process needs to be documented and, needs to be defined, and the investigation should be carried out independently by competent personnel without conflicts of interest. And I know Nadita spoke out before, she would have explained the whole issue with conflict of interest, right? Now, the outcomes of these investigations are supposed to feed into other parts of the systems, and they should be used for improving the compliance management system, as well as they should be reported to the governing body. Right, so where management has the information, it should be reported as well to the governing body, because the governing body still has overall responsibility for governing the compliance management system. All right, clause 9 starts. Clause 9 deals with performance evaluation, and clause 9 starts with a subclause on mentoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation. Monitoring is the process of gathering information for the purpose of assessing the effectiveness of the compliance management system and of the organization's compliance performance. The standard outlines sources of feedback that can be used for making this assessment, and it provides guidance on methods for collecting the information. It also provides information on how developing appropriate indicators that would assist the organization in evaluating whether it has achieved its compliance objectives. The clause covers the requirements for timely and accurate reporting and record keeping. And clause 9 also includes requirements for conducting internal audits at planned intervals to ensure that the compliance management system conforms with what the organization says it will do and with the requirements of the standard. Now, audit functions, whether internal or external, should be free of conflicts of interest and be independent in order to fulfill their role. Another method for performance evaluations are management reviews. And management reviews addresses the need for the governing body and top management to periodically review the compliance management system to ensure that it continues to be suitable, adequate, and effective for the organization's compliance needs. So it gives an outline of what should be some of the inputs into the management review process and what should be some of the results and what should be done with the results when they are obtained. And this brings us to the last clause, which is improvements. And some of what we just spoke about in clause 9 serves as an input into the improvement process. So there are two subclauses here, continual improvement and addressing nonconformity and corrective action, both of which contribute to overall improvement of the system. And the effectiveness of a compliance management system is characterized by the fact that it has the capacity to continually improve and evolve. The organization's internal and external environment and business changes over time, as do the nature of its customers and applicable compliance obligations. Therefore, the adequacy and the effectiveness of the compliance management system should be assessed on a continual and regular basis through several methods. Sources of information for continual improvement can be employee surveys in order to assess the compliance culture, which is one of the things we say that we want embedded in the organization, as well as to evaluate the strength of controls. Also, we can use the results of customer surveys, reports, raising concerns, monitoring the audits and the management reviews as inputs into determining, as inputs into improving the system. A key aspect of continual improvement, as I have mentioned, is of course taking corrective action when non-conformity or non-compliance occurs. And this is covered in the last clause. So the standard would give guidance on how this corrective action, the results of corrective action should be used to improve the system. All right, so to summarize, this standard, the document specifies the requirements and provides guidelines for establishing, developing, implementing, evaluating, maintaining, and improving an effective compliance management system within an organization. And again, it's a reminder that it is applicable to all kinds of organizations, regardless of the type, size, and nature. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. I'll just hand you back to Nadita. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrea, for giving us that overview of the compliance management system. So I wanted to find out from the participants, are there any questions that you would like to raise live? So if so, you can raise your hand and we will take a few questions. We were originally supposed to finish at 4, but we will go on for a few more minutes before we wrap up. So if there are any live questions, please raise your hand and let us know. So I'm not seeing any hands being raised as yet, but I will invite Axel and Andrea to just, give a close. So I'll go to Axel first and then you, Andrea, and let's see if we get any live questions.
Okay, yes. So I think it's we are at an important waypoint for Trinidad and Tobago, where Trinidad and Tobago has engaged in this process for the last 5 years, and that it's an important point that soon these standards will be national standards, and many organizations that have been asking for relevant standards and modern standards for their organizations will now be able to access them through the TTBS and be continuously involved in a system in which these standards are being maintained over time, so that the relevance and the effectiveness of them are assured. And because there are many things to be done and much to be achieved. So application is the key. But having collective agreement as to what do we apply and what do we mean by good governance, because a lot of organizations are saying these things very lightly. Okay.
Thank you, Axel. So I'm not seeing any hands being raised. We got a couple of comments in the chat, and I believe most of them were answered. So I would invite any last minute questions until, okay, so I see Mr. London has a question. So you can unmute Mr. London.
Okay, good afternoon to each and everyone. I'm Glenroy London. So earlier on in the presentation, I heard you give a definition for competence. But somewhere in that definition, you didn't link competence to attaining the organizational strategic objectives. So it had me sort of kind of searching myself to find out, you know, in terms of the standard, if at all, if you are seeing competence having anything to do with attainment of strategic objectives towards the goal of performance optimization of the organization.
Thank you, Mr. London. So I'll turn it over to Axel.
Right. So one way of thinking about competence here also is that, so 37,000 speaks about competence a little bit, not, you know, not greatly. It's like, you know, a paragraph and some bullets, but it does lay out some of the key competence requirements for governing bodies. And one way to think of it is that a governing body is competent collectively if it is able to deal with the business that comes before it, with the usual business that comes before it, without the support of additional help, right? So, deal with it means that now that they are able to process it in a way that they are able to have the three main governance outcomes, which are effective performance, responsible stewardship, and ethical behavior. So an organization that makes profit, but that has no control over the way it is using resources and doesn't know how much it is polluting, cannot be called an organization that is governed well, right? Or an organization that is acting against its own published policies cannot be called to be governed well. So, I mean, and being able to deal with this is competence at a collective level. And competency, we can think of also at the level of individual members involved in governance. Does that help?
Well, it has, but I don't think it quite zones in on the concept of, say, competence assurance, which in my mind is more than, say, an HR function of where someone is probably experienced, certified. It has to do with how does this organization attain its strategic objectives, and to attain it repeatedly, going through the processes. If you have, if it's process, you have business and workflow processes, and one must be able to go through those business and workflow processes and get optimal results. And with each business cycle, keep doing better and better towards performance optimization. Then I would tend to, look at assurance of competence in those terms. If we just look at the HR aspect of it, people may have lots of qualification, lots of experience, but we are not executing our work and business flow processes optimally. So the organization is not really a learning and growing organization. So you need competent people, and there needs to be assurance around that competence by looking at competence in terms of behavioral skills, IT skills, technological skills, and other areas. So you can look at the overall competence of the incumbent, and then peg that to the organization attaining its strategy. But for some reason, I don't think that most of the standards really doesn't get probably so deep and so integrated in terms of how they deem persons competent. And sometimes you engage the wrong persons in the recruitment process because you haven't really pegged them or aligned them to the specific job functions and the workflow processes and business flow processes. So that's basically my concern at this point in time. And probably we are a bit off in that, and hopefully that the future shall bring some closure.
No, but it is. So I mean, in the standard in 37,000, I can tell you for sure, but it is in the management systems as well. So continuous improvement is very much emphasized. And the way that it is being dealt with is that you need a competent governing body and competent people in order to determine what value is, what are strategic goals, what is a reasonable way for achieving it, delegating it effectively, being able to institute oversight, assure yourself against the oversight, take corrective action as a result of the oversight process, and in a way that achieves performance, ethical behavior, and responsible stewardship. So it is very much, I think, captured in the standard, but in different components as a system. And competence itself is also defined to include three main dimensions: the knowledge, the skills, and the experience necessary in order to deal with these topics. So I think it is also a little bit about the wording and how we use the terminology, but the sentiment of continuous improvement and achieving the objectives of the organization, I think, is very strongly and repeatedly dealt with in the standards, I would say.
Okay, yeah. Well, I take note of your comments, but I think there is room for further debate. We may not have the time to pursue this debate. Probably we can pursue it in other forums.
Welcome that, sure.
So thanks for the feedback.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. London, Axel. So there was just one comment that I saw from Mr. Bowler. With these standards, relationship to 9001 is mentioned. What about other standards in use now, like 17 or 25? So I think the quick response to that is that all these standards are intended to be integrated, and they can be integrated. So 17 and 25 deal specifically with laboratories, etc. So there is the possibility of integration and using it in a similar way. So I'm not seeing any additional questions coming up in the chat. And we just have a couple of comments, so I think they're well noted. So thank you everyone for the comments. Andrea, I don't know if you wanted to give any last remarks before we close.
Thanks to Mr. London for his comments, and it would be useful if we can get feedback from as many persons as possible as we go forward with the adoption of these standards. One of the benefits we have if we're able to adopt these standards is then we would have control. I know somebody mentioned about the cost, about ISO 9001 being the most cost effective, but then we would also have control on the cost of these and making them, these standards widely available throughout the country. So thank you.
Okay, so Axel, do you want to, give any further insights into that aspect of it? Because there's a question from Mr. Chinapu about how soon the standard will be adopted.
Well, no, I cannot. You are best positioned to say that. I think it just needs to go through the process of making sure that any comments are addressed and that so I think it's a clear path, but I cannot predict how quickly people meet and all that. So I think March, April, I think should be a good expectation.
Okay, so I'll just go into the steps that are required for the national adoption. The closing date for comments is the 20th of February, so we would appreciate written comments. So all the participants would have my email, so we'll take all the comments into consideration. Depending on the extent of the comments, we will reconvene a meeting of the National Merit Committee to review and address the comments. One of the possibilities with a national adoption would be to include any national deviations as necessary. So once we have gotten the written feedback, we will make a determination as to whether we want to include any national deviations. Other than that, then the process is that the draft standards would go to our technical and marketing subcommittee of our TTBS board of directors. And once they have given their recommendation that the standard be approved, then it goes to our board of directors for declaration. And that really constitutes the approval. The final step that will conclude the adoption process will be the publication of a legal notice in our Trinidad and Tobago Gazette. And then we will seek to publish the national standard and brand it as a Trinidad and Tobago standard. So it will have its own national cover and it will be available for sale via our web store. So those are the main process steps. So it really hinges on getting feedback, even if it is to say that there's agreement on the proposed content. For the international standards, we don't normally receive a lot of feedback because it has gone through an extensive review process. I would highlight that we had 6 webinars, I think in 2019 or so, to go through the international standard for 37,000 when it was in public inquiry at the international level, and we got feedback there, which were reviewed and submitted to the ISO technical committee. So Axel had the wonderful task of reviewing all the comments from all the members of TC 309, and it received a significant level of consensus. And I think that was a milestone as well. So those are the essential process steps. So if there are no further questions, I'd like to invite Rodney if he wanted to say a few words, and then we'll move to close the session today.
Hi, good afternoon again, everyone. So in closing, I would just like to thank all of our participants for coming and participating in the discussions. Of course, I would like to thank our distinguished panel here of experts who have worked on the standards and who have described the intent and purpose of the standards and the way that it can be applied. So again, just thanks everyone for the comments. We will be looking at those very, very seriously as we move forward for the publication of the national standard. Back to you, Nalisa.
Thank you, Rodney. I'd just like to extend my thanks as well to all the participants today. The discussion has been very informative in the chat, and we were happy to present the main requirements of these international standards that we will now be adopting as Trinidad and Tobago standards. So the feedback is appreciated, and we look forward to further contact with all the stakeholders. So everyone should have my email address, and if there's anything further, we have up to the 20th to take into account any considerations that may have been not considered in the international draft as we seek to engage in a national adoption process. So again, on behalf of TTBS, thank you everyone, and we appreciate your time and feedback today. So we will seek to end the meeting, and I will be in contact via email with a reminder. So thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, folks.